never planned to cause thousands of dollars in damage, but she left me no choice. It was a chaotic Tuesday morning, the kind that neighbors gossip about for years. A police cruiser was parked haphazardly in front of my driveway, its blue and red lights bouncing off the beige vinyl siding of the suburban homes. A young woman was screaming, shrieking really, pointing a manicured finger at me while a police officer stood between us, looking exhausted. I stood on my porch, a warm mug of coffee in my hand, looking past her hysteria to the 4 completely shredded tires resting on the asphalt. I took a sip of my coffee and felt a cold, hard satisfaction settle in my chest. But to understand how everything fell apart, we have to go back to the beginning. My name is Mateo, and for the last 5 years, I've lived in a quiet, standard cul-de-sac. It's the kind of place where people mow their lawns on Saturdays and wave when they get the mail. It was my sanctuary. But more importantly, it was the last place I lived with my mother before she moved back to Mexico. Leaving the States was hard for her. This house held decades of memories, raising my brother and me, navigating the storms of life. Before she left, she spent weeks in the front yard, on her hands and knees, planting a row of vibrant, deep red roses right along the edge of the property line. She told me, "Mateo, these are for you. When they bloom, you'll know I'm thinking of you." Those roses weren't just plants. They were her legacy. They were the physical embodiment of her love. Every weekend, I was out there pruning, watering, and feeding them. I knew every petal, every thorn. They were the pride of the neighborhood, a splash of crimson against the green lawns. Enter the neighbors, specifically the neighbor's daughter. Let's call her Chloe. Chloe was in her mid-20s, drove a massive white SUV that was far too big for her driving abilities, and possessed an attitude that suggested the world existed solely to serve her. Our driveways ran parallel to each other, separated by a strip of grass about 6 feet wide. My roses sat right on the edge of my side of that strip. The problem started subtly. Chloe had a habit of swinging wide when she pulled into her parents' driveway. Instead of taking the turn properly, she would cut the wheel too early, rolling her heavy tires over the corner of my lawn. The first time it happened, I saw the tire track in the mud. It missed the rose bushes by inches. I let it go. It was raining, maybe the visibility was bad. I didn't want to be the guy who complained about a little dirt. But then it happened again. And again. By the 5th time, it wasn't just mud. She was carving a rut into my yard. The grass was dying, replaced by a permanent tread mark. I watched from my window one evening as she pulled in. She didn't even slow down to check her angle. She just careened onto my property, her heavy vehicle churning up the soil, dangerously close to the root systems of my mother's roses. I decided to handle it like a calm, rational adult. I waited until I saw her getting out of the car. I walked over, forcing a polite smile. "Hey, Chloe, how are you?" She looked up from her phone, barely acknowledging me. "Fine. Hey, I just wanted to ask a huge favor," I said, pointing to the ruts. "You've been catching the edge of my lawn when you pull in. I have those rose bushes right there. My mom planted them, and I'm terrified they're going to get crushed. Could you just swing a little wider next time?" She glanced at the mud, then back at me, popping her gum. "Okay, sure." She didn't apologize. She didn't look embarrassed. She just turned and walked into her house. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I came home from work to find disaster. A heavy rainstorm had passed through, making the ground soft. Chloe's tracks weren't just near the roses this time. She had clipped the edge of the bed. One of the bushes was leaning precariously, its roots exposed to the air. My heart hammered in my chest. I fell to my knees in the wet dirt, trying to pack the soil back around the roots, whispering apologies to a plant as if my mother could hear me. I managed to save it, but the rage was starting to build. I needed a physical barrier. Words clearly weren't working. I went to the hardware store and bought heavy, decorative landscaping bricks. These weren't small. They were solid concrete blocks about 3 inches tall. I spent an entire Saturday digging a trench and setting them in concrete along the perimeter of the lawn. It looked nice, too. It framed the roses perfectly. I stepped back, wiping sweat from my forehead, thinking I had finally solved the problem. It lasted exactly 10 days. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard a sickening thud crunch sound. I dropped my spatula and ran to the window. Chloe's SUV was parked in her driveway, but behind it, my beautiful brick border was in ruins. She had driven right over them. 3 of the heavy bricks were dislodged, cracked, and pushed deep into the flower bed, crushing the lower branches of the roses. I didn't wait this time. I walked right out the front door. Chloe was gathering her purse from the passenger seat. "Chloe!" I shouted, my voice shaking with adrenaline. She looked over, annoyed. "What?" "Look at this!" I pointed to the shattered bricks. "I put these here specifically so you wouldn't drive on my lawn. You just drove right over them." She slammed her car door shut and rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. "It's dark, okay? I didn't see your stupid rocks." "They aren't rocks," I snapped. "They are a border. You are driving on my property. You are destroying my yard." She let out a scoff, a sound of pure condescension. She looked me up and down, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh my God," she laughed. "It's just some dirt. Why do you have your panties in a bunch? Get a life." The air left my lungs. Panties in a bunch. I stood there, stunned, as she strutted up her walkway and disappeared into her house. I looked down at the crushed roses, the ones my mother had planted with her own hands before leaving the country. I looked at the broken bricks I had spent hours installing. That was the moment. That was the turning point. Something inside me shifted from annoyance to cold, calculated resolve. She didn't respect me. She didn't respect my property. She thought she could bully her way through life because she drove a big car and didn't care about consequences. I realized then that talking was useless. Barriers she could push over were useless. I needed to change the rules of engagement. But I wasn't going to be reckless. I was going to be smart. The next morning, I took a half day off work. I drove to the Homeowners Association office. I sat down with the property manager, a nice woman named Barbara, who took her job very seriously. "Barbara," I said, opening the rulebook on her desk, "I need to make a modification to my yard's perimeter. I have a vehicle constantly encroaching on my property, destroying my landscaping. I want to put in a reinforced border. Are there any restrictions on the materials I can use for edging?" Barbara flipped through the bylaws. She checked the height restrictions, the setback rules, and the aesthetic guidelines. "As long as it's within your property line and doesn't exceed 6 inches in height," she said, peering over her glasses, "there are no rules specifying what the core material has to be. You can reinforce it however you like." "Can I get that in writing?" I asked. She printed it out. I signed it. I had the green light. I went home and removed the broken bricks. I cleaned up the debris. Then I went to work on my masterpiece. I didn't buy new bricks. I made them. I built wooden molds exactly the same size as the decorative bricks I had before. I bought a bag of high-strength concrete, and then I bought a box of long, galvanized steel landscaping spikes, heavy-duty nails used for securing timber. I mixed the concrete in a bucket in my garage. The slurry was thick and gray. I poured it into the molds, smoothing the tops. Then, while the concrete was still wet, I carefully inserted the spikes. I didn't hide them, but I didn't advertise them either. I placed the nails so they poked out about an inch, maybe an inch and a half. They were rigid, immovable, and sharp. I let them cure for 48 hours. When they were done, they looked like medieval torture devices masquerading as garden decor. I laid them around the perimeter of my yard, exactly where the old bricks had been. I secured them into the ground with rebar so they couldn't be kicked loose. To the naked eye, from the driver's seat of a tall SUV, they looked just like the previous border, gray, blocky, unassuming. But if you hit these, you wouldn't just knock them over. I finished the installation on a Sunday evening. I watered the roses, apologized to them for the drama, and went inside. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait. Monday passed without incident. Chloe didn't go out. Tuesday evening, around 7 p.m., I was in my living room reading. The streetlights had just flickered on. I heard the familiar rumble of the white SUV coming down the street. My stomach tightened. I put my book down. I didn't look out the window. I just listened. I heard the engine slow down. I heard the turn signal. Then I heard it. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a bang. It was a dull, grinding noise, followed by a hiss that was audible even through my insulated windows. Push. The car kept moving for a few feet, then stopped. I heard a car door open, then slam shut. I heard footsteps walking away. She hadn't realized. She must have thought she'd just hit the curb again. The tires on that SUV were massive run flats or reinforced all-terrains. They wouldn't collapse instantly. She had parked in her driveway and gone inside, completely unaware that she had just driven over a row of concrete-embedded spikes. I slept like a baby that night. The next morning, the chaos began. I woke up to pounding on my front door, violent, angry pounding. I checked the time, 7:45 a.m. I threw on a robe and walked downstairs. Through the frosted glass, I could see figures moving. I opened the door, and there was Chloe. Her face was red, her hair was a mess, and she looked like she was about to explode. Her father was standing behind her, looking grim. "You!" she screamed, pointing at me. "You slashed my tires!" I blinked, feigning sleepiness. "Excuse me?" "My tires! All of them! They're flat! You vandalized my car because you're a psycho!" I looked past her. Sure enough, the white SUV was sitting on its rims. It looked like a beached whale. "I didn't touch your car," I said calmly. "Liar!" she screeched. "I called the cops. They're on their way." "Good," I said. "Let's wait for them." I closed the door in her face. 10 minutes later, the blue and red lights washed over the living room. I went back out, coffee in hand. The officer was a tall man who looked like he had dealt with too many domestic disputes that week. Chloe was already bending his ear, gesturing wildly at her car and then at me. "He put spikes in his yard," she yelled. "He set a trap for me. That's illegal. It's assault." The officer walked over to me. "Sir, are you aware of the damage to this vehicle?" "I see the damage, officer," I said, "but I didn't touch her vehicle." "She claims you put spikes on your property specifically to damage her tires." "I put a reinforced decorative border on my property to protect my mother's rose garden," I corrected him. "I have verified with the HOA that I am allowed to modify the perimeter of my lawn. I warned this neighbor repeatedly not to drive on my land. I asked nicely. I put up plain bricks, which she destroyed. She laughed in my face when I asked her to stop. I walked the officer over to the edge of the lawn. The new concrete blocks were there, standing strong. You could see the scrape marks on the steel spikes where the rubber had met the road. "Officer," I said, pointing to the property line, "this is my land. That is her driveway. If she had stayed on her driveway, her car would be fine. The only reason her tires are popped is because she drove off the pavement and onto my garden." The officer looked at the blocks. He looked at the spikes. He looked at the tire tracks that clearly went off the asphalt and into the dirt of my yard. He turned to Chloe. "Ma'am, the officer said, his voice flat. Arrest him, Chloe shouted. Ma'am, calm down, the officer ordered. I can't arrest him. He hasn't committed a crime. Chloe's jaw dropped. What? He destroyed my car? No, ma'am, the officer said, pulling out his notepad. You destroyed your car. You were driving on his private property. He has a right to place landscaping borders on his own land. If you had stayed on the driveway, this wouldn't have happened. Technically, you're vandalizing his yard. The silence that followed was heavy. Chloe looked at her father for support, but he was staring at the ground, clearly realizing that his daughter's driving had finally caught up with her. But the spikes, she stammered, all the fight draining out of her. Don't drive on his lawn, the officer said, closing his notebook. That's the end of it. It's a civil matter if you want to sue, but I'm telling you right now, looking at these tracks, you're going to lose. The officer got back in his car. I stood there, taking a sip of my coffee. Chloe looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The panties in a bunch attitude had evaporated. She looked like a child who had just been told Santa wasn't real. I can't afford 4 new tires, she whispered, almost to herself. I looked at my roses. A few petals had fallen from the vibration of her car hitting the blocks, but the bushes were standing tall. They were safe. That sounds like a problem for someone who drives on other people's property, I said. I turned around and went back inside. I watched from the window as a tow truck arrived an hour later. It took them a long time to get the SUV onto the flatbed because the rims were so low to the ground. Chloe stood on the sidewalk the whole time, arms crossed, crying. Since that day, she hasn't driven on my grass once. In fact, she parks on the street now. She won't even pull into the driveway. After a few weeks, once the point had been thoroughly made, I went out and removed the spiked concrete blocks. I replaced them with the standard store-bought bricks. They look nicer, and honestly, I don't need the spikes anymore. The memory of that tow truck bill is barrier enough. The roses are blooming beautifully this year. They are bright red, huge, and smell like victory. Every time I see them, I think of my mom, and I think of the silence that now reigns over my property line. I protected what was mine. I didn't start the war, but I certainly finished it. So, was I wrong for this?